The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient red rocks of the Grand Canyon as James Donovan adjusted his worn leather hiking boots for the final time. At 58, Jim possessed the weathered hands of a man who had spent decades reading the Earth's stories through stone and sediment. His calloused fingers traced the rim of his geological hammer, a tool that had become as natural to him as breathing. The metal gleamed dully in the early light, bearing countless tiny scratches from years of splitting rocks and uncovering secrets buried within limestone and sandstone formations. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Jim's eyes, a steel gray that seemed to mirror the canyon's morning mist, swept across the vast expanse before him. The Tonto Trail stretched out like a serpentine ribbon, carved into the canyon's ancient walls by countless footsteps over generations. He had walked this particular section dozens of times, each journey revealing new geological treasures that most hikers would pass without a second glance. The familiar weight of his field notebook pressed against his chest pocket, its pages already filled with detailed sketches of rock formations, mineral compositions, and stratigraphic observations from previous expeditions. The hiking group gathered around their guide, a cheerful woman in her 30s whose enthusiasm for the canyon's natural beauty was infectious. Jim stood slightly apart from the cluster of tourists, his weathered face displaying the quiet confidence of someone who knew these trails as intimately as the lines on his own palm. His backpack, a faded green canvas model that had accompanied him on countless adventures, sat perfectly balanced on his shoulders. Every strap had been adjusted with methodical precision, every pocket organized with the systematic attention to detail that had made him such a respected amateur geologist in his community. The other hikers chatted nervously about the day ahead, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Jim listened with half an ear, his attention drawn instead to a particular rock formation visible in the distance. The way the morning light struck the exposed layers told a story of ancient seas and prehistoric landscapes that few people could read. His fingers itched to examine the striations more closely, to chip away small samples that might reveal secrets about the Earth's distant past. As the group began their descent into the canyon's depths, Jim's boots found their rhythm on the familiar path. Each step was placed with deliberate care, not from uncertainty but from a deep respect for the terrain's hidden dangers. The trail wound through juniper and pinyon pine, their twisted branches creating intricate patterns of shadow and light on the red earth below. The air grew warmer as they descended, carrying the distinctive scent of sage and desert flowers that bloomed in hidden crevices throughout the canyon. 3 hours into the hike, Jim paused at a bend in the trail where a particularly interesting geological formation caught his attention. The exposed rock face displayed layers of different colored stones stacked like pages in an ancient book, each stratum representing millions of years of geological history. His trained eye detected unusual mineral deposits glinting in the afternoon sun, formations that didn't match the typical composition he had studied in this section of the canyon. The guide announced a rest stop at the designated meeting point, a small clearing where the trail widened and offered spectacular views of the canyon's inner gorge. Jim approached her with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through years of careful observation and patient study. His voice, roughened by decades of outdoor adventures, carried a tone of polite but firm determination as he explained his intention to investigate the geological anomaly he had spotted. The rock formation was located approximately half a mile from the main trail, accessible through a narrow side path that most hikers would never notice. Jim had discovered this particular route during a previous expedition, following deer tracks that led to a hidden ledge offering unique access to several interesting geological features. The guide hesitated, clearly concerned about deviating from established safety protocols, but Jim's reputation and experience were well known among the canyon's regular hiking community. His promise to rejoin the group at their predetermined meeting point 2 miles further along the trail was made with the casual confidence of someone who had never failed to honor such commitments. The other hikers barely glanced up as he shouldered his pack and headed toward the narrow side trail, their attention focused on rest and refreshment after the morning's exertion. The guide made a note of his departure time in her logbook, a routine precaution that would later prove crucial to investigators. The side trail was barely visible, marked only by occasional cairns that Jim had placed during previous visits. The path wound through increasingly rugged terrain, requiring careful navigation around loose rocks and thorny vegetation. Jim's movements were fluid and economical, each step chosen to minimize disturbance to the fragile desert ecosystem while maintaining steady progress toward his geological target. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the hiking group reached their designated meeting point and settled in to wait. The guide checked her watch repeatedly, initially unconcerned but gradually developing a nagging worry as minutes stretched into an hour. Jim had never been late to a rendezvous, and his absence began to feel increasingly ominous as the sun continued its inexorable descent toward the western rim of the canyon. The discovery of Jim's backpack came just as the golden hour light was painting the canyon walls in brilliant shades of orange and red. One of the hikers spotted the familiar green canvas partially hidden beneath a cluster of prickly pear cactus, approximately 200 yards from where Jim had left the main trail. The pack sat upright against a boulder, as if carefully placed rather than dropped or abandoned in haste. The guide's hands trembled slightly as she examined the backpack's contents, finding everything exactly as it should be. Jim's water bottles were full, his emergency food supplies untouched, and his first aid kit remained sealed in its waterproof pouch. Most disturbing was the presence of his geological hammer and field notebook, tools that Jim would never willingly abandon. The notebook's final entry, dated that morning, contained detailed sketches of the rock formation that had captured his interest, along with preliminary observations about unusual mineral compositions that had drawn him away from the group. The absence of any signs of struggle around the backpack's location created an atmosphere of creeping dread among the hikers. The surrounding ground showed no evidence of a fall or accident, no scattered belongings or damaged equipment that might explain Jim's disappearance. His hiking boots had left clear tracks leading toward the backpack's location, but beyond that point, the rocky terrain revealed no further traces of his passage. As darkness began to descend into the canyon's depths, the guide made the difficult decision to initiate emergency protocols. Her radio crackled to life as she contacted park headquarters, her voice steady despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The stark reality of Jim's vanishing began to sink in as she provided details to the dispatcher, describing a scenario that defied logical explanation. The other hikers huddled together in the gathering darkness, their earlier excitement replaced by a profound sense of unease. The vast canyon that had seemed so beautiful and welcoming just hours before now loomed around them like a massive, impenetrable maze. The silence that followed the guide's radio transmission was broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, its haunting call echoing off the ancient stone walls that had witnessed countless mysteries throughout the ages. Jim's disappearance had begun, not with drama or violence, but with the quiet, inexplicable absence of a man who knew these trails better than almost anyone alive. The abandoned backpack, sitting like a riddle in the fading light, would become the first piece in a puzzle that would consume his family's thoughts and challenge the assumptions of everyone who thought they understood the predictable dangers of the Grand Canyon. The fluorescent lights in the Grand Canyon National Park headquarters cast harsh shadows across Ranger Anya Sharma's desk as she filled out the initial missing person report at 3:17 in the morning. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency across the keyboard, each keystroke echoing in the sterile silence of the administrative office. The coffee in her ceramic mug had grown cold hours ago, a bitter film forming on its surface, but she continued to sip it mechanically while transcribing the details provided by the hiking guide. Anya's dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion after being called in during her off-duty hours, scanned the standardized form on her computer screen. Missing hiker reports were disturbingly common in the Grand Canyon, averaging nearly 300 cases per year, according to the statistics that haunted her dreams. Most involved disoriented tourists who had wandered off marked trails, dehydrated day hikers who had underestimated the desert's brutal demands, or inexperienced adventurers who had attempted routes far beyond their capabilities. The fluorescent bulb above her desk flickered intermittently, casting wavering shadows across the neat stacks of incident reports that chronicled the canyon's regular collection of human tragedies. Anya rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar tension headache that accompanied these late-night emergencies. The park's search and rescue protocols had been refined through decades of experience, each procedure designed to maximize efficiency while managing limited resources across the canyon's vast and treacherous terrain. At dawn, the search operation commenced with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed military exercise. 3 teams of rangers assembled in the parking lot beside the South Rim Visitor Center. their vehicles loaded with standard equipment that had proven effective in countless previous operations. Portable radios crackled with routine communications as team leaders verified their assigned search grids, each section carefully plotted on topographical maps that reduced the canyon's magnificent complexity to a series of coordinates and elevation markers. Anya led the primary search team along the Tonto Trail, following the exact route that Jim's hiking group had taken the previous day. Her boots crunched rhythmically on the gravelly trail surface as she maintained a steady pace, her trained eyes automatically scanning the terrain for any signs of disturbance or deviation from the established path. Behind her, 2 junior rangers followed in single file, their younger faces displaying the focused concentration of professionals who understood the serious nature of their mission. The morning air carried the crisp clarity that preceded the desert's daily transformation into a furnace of heat and blinding light. Anya's weathered hands adjusted the brim of her wide-brimmed hat, protecting her face from the sun's increasingly aggressive rays. Her water bottles, secured to her belt with military-style clips, sloshed gently with each step, a constant reminder of the life-sustaining liquid that separated survival from tragedy in this unforgiving landscape. The search team reached the location where Jim's backpack had been discovered within 90 minutes of beginning their systematic sweep. Anya crouched beside the boulder where the pack had rested, her experienced fingers examining the surrounding ground for clues that might have been overlooked in the previous evening's fading light. The red sand around the boulder bore the subtle impressions of multiple footprints, most belonging to the hiking group members who had discovered the abandoned equipment. Her radio squawked with regular updates from the other search teams, each report following the same predictable pattern of negative findings and continued systematic coverage of their assigned areas. The canyon's immense scale became brutally apparent as the hours passed without any significant discoveries. Thousands of hidden crevices, countless boulder fields, and innumerable side canyons created a labyrinth where a missing person could remain concealed indefinitely. By midday, the searchers had expanded their grid to encompass a 2-mile radius from Jim's last known location. Anya felt the familiar frustration that accompanied these operations, knowing that every additional hour reduced the likelihood of finding the missing hiker alive. The desert's punishing heat, which had already reached over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, created conditions that would quickly overwhelm an unprepared person lacking adequate water and shelter. The helicopter arrived during the afternoon, its rotors creating a thunderous din that reverberated off the canyon walls in overlapping echoes. From her position on the Tonto Trail, Anya watched the aircraft execute systematic flight patterns over the search area, the pilot following predetermined routes designed to provide maximum visual coverage of the most probable locations where a missing hiker might be found. 3 days of intensive searching yielded nothing more substantial than Jim's abandoned backpack and a few boot prints that disappeared into the rocky terrain. Anya found herself completing the paperwork that would officially suspend the active search operation, her pen moving reluctantly across forms that reduced Jim's disappearance to a series of bureaucratic checkboxes and statistical categories. The telephone call came on a Thursday morning, interrupting Anya's review of incident reports from the previous week. Lena Donovan's voice carried across the phone line with a clarity that made her presence feel immediate despite the physical distance separating them. The grief in her words was palpable, mixed with an underlying steel that suggested a woman unaccustomed to accepting defeat or bureaucratic indifference. Anya's office felt suffocatingly small as Lena's questions cut through the standard explanations and procedural justifications that formed the foundation of Park Service communications with grieving families. The institutional responses that usually provided comfort and closure seemed inadequate when confronted with Lena's intimate knowledge of her brother's capabilities and character. The conversation stretched across 45 minutes, during which Anya found herself increasingly uncomfortable with the limitations of the park's investigative approach. Lena's detailed description of Jim's hiking experience, his meticulous preparation methods, and his intimate familiarity with the Tonto Trail created a profile that didn't match the typical missing hiker scenario. Her brother's geological expertise and decades of canyon exploration suggested someone far too experienced to simply become disoriented or make fatal navigational errors. Week after week, Lena's phone calls continued with relentless persistence. Her voice became a fixture in Anya's daily routine, arriving promptly each Thursday morning with new questions, alternative theories, and increasingly desperate requests for expanded search efforts. The pain in her words was raw and undiminished by time, carrying an emotional weight that made it impossible for Anya to dismiss her concerns with standard bureaucratic responses. The official case file, which had initially been thick with incident reports and search documentation, gradually became thinner as weeks passed without new developments. Administrative pressure to focus resources on active cases meant that Jim's disappearance joined the unfortunate collection of unsolved mysteries that haunted the Grand Canyon's history. The statistical category of missing hiker, presumed deceased, provided closure for the park's administrative needs, but offered no comfort to a sister whose questions remained unanswered. Anya's desk drawer contained a growing collection of newspaper clippings that Lena had mailed from her home across the country. Each article detailed similar disappearances in national parks, cases where experienced hikers had vanished without logical explanation, leaving behind families who refused to accept official conclusions of accidental death or voluntary disappearance. The patterns Lena had identified were compelling, suggesting systemic issues that extended far beyond individual cases of poor judgment or bad luck. The frustration that gnawed at Anya's professional satisfaction centered on the stark contrast between the park's efficient response to typical emergencies and its apparent helplessness when confronted with cases that didn't conform to established patterns. Jim's disappearance challenged fundamental assumptions about hiker behavior and canyon dangers, creating uncomfortable questions about whether the park's investigative procedures were adequate for truly mysterious cases. 3 months after the search had been officially suspended, Anya found herself standing at the exact spot where Jim's backpack had been discovered. The boulder looked unchanged, weathered by countless storms and baked by endless days of desert sun. The surrounding landscape revealed no secrets, maintaining the stoic silence that had frustrated searchers and left Lena's questions hanging in the air like desert heat mirages. The weight of institutional indifference pressed down on Anya's shoulders as she contemplated the growing distance between her professional obligations and her personal sense that Jim Donovan deserved more than a file folder marked "Case Closed" gathering dust in the park's administrative archives. The October sun hung low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the Tonto Trail as Marcus Chen adjusted the focus on his camera lens for what he hoped would be the perfect golden hour photograph. At 26, Marcus possessed the restless energy of a freelance photographer who had spent the past 3 months documenting America's national parks for a travel magazine assignment. His weathered hiking boots, purchased second-hand from a thrift store in Flagstaff, had carried him through dozens of trails, each step adding to the collection of scenic images that would eventually pay his rent. Marcus paused beside a distinctive red sandstone formation that jutted from the trail like an ancient sentinel, its surface carved by millennia of wind and rain into intricate patterns that resembled hieroglyphics. The rock face caught the afternoon light in a way that created dramatic contrasts between shadow and illumination, exactly the type of natural composition that editors loved for magazine spreads. He knelt on the rocky ground, ignoring the sharp stones that pressed against his knees through his worn jeans, and began adjusting his camera settings. The discovery came by accident, as so many significant findings do. Marcus had positioned himself at an unusual angle to capture the interplay of light and shadow on the rock face, when his peripheral vision caught sight of something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Scratched into a smooth section of the sandstone, approximately 4 feet above the trail surface, were letters that had been deliberately carved into the rock with what appeared to be a sharp metal tool. His heart rate accelerated as he moved closer to examine the markings, abandoning his photography equipment on the trail behind him. The scratched letters were crude, but clearly intentional, carved deep enough into the rock surface to ensure they would remain visible despite the constant weathering that eroded softer inscriptions. The message, written in block capital letters, read, "It wasn't me. They took me south." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he retrieved his camera, switching from landscape mode to close-up macro settings that would capture every detail of the carved message. The letters showed signs of having been created hastily, with irregular depths and slightly uneven spacing that suggested urgency rather than careful planning. Tiny fragments of sandstone still clung to some of the carved grooves, indicating that the inscription was relatively recent compared to the ancient geological formations surrounding it. The implications of his discovery began to crystallize in Marcus's mind as he documented the message from multiple angles, ensuring that his photographs would provide clear evidence of both the inscription's content and its precise location. This was no casual graffiti left by bored tourists or territorial marking by local hikers. The desperate tone of the message, combined with its isolated location along a trail known for its challenging terrain, suggested something far more sinister. Marcus spent the remainder of the afternoon meticulously photographing the area surrounding the carved message, documenting potential clues that might have been overlooked by previous hikers. His trained photographer's eye noticed subtle disturbances in the rocky ground near the base of the formation, areas where the natural arrangement of stones appeared to have been disrupted by human activity. Small fragments of fabric, bleached gray by months of exposure to desert sun, clung to thorny vegetation growing in crevices near the inscription. The hike back to the South Rim Visitor Center felt interminable as Marcus struggled with the weight of his discovery. The carved message seemed to burn in his memory, its desperate words repeating endlessly in his thoughts as he navigated the familiar trail that had suddenly transformed from a scenic photography location into potential evidence of a serious crime. Every shadow seemed to conceal hidden dangers. Every sound carried implications of threat and violence that had never occurred to him during previous solo hiking expeditions. The park ranger at the visitor center information desk initially treated Marcus's report with the polite skepticism typically reserved for tourist complaints about overcrowded trails and inadequate restroom facilities. Her expression changed dramatically when he produced his digital camera and showed her the close-up photographs of the carved message. The crude letters, captured in sharp detail against the red sandstone background, created an immediate sense of urgency that transformed the routine inquiry into an active investigation. Within 30 minutes, Ranger Anya Sharma arrived at the visitor center, her face displaying the weary resignation of someone who had dealt with too many false alarms and tourist misunderstandings. Marcus watched her expression transform as she scrolled through his photographs, her professional composure cracking slightly when she realized the potential significance of his discovery. Her fingers moved quickly across her smartphone screen, accessing case files and missing person reports that might be connected to the mysterious message. The connection to Jim Donovan's disappearance became apparent within minutes of cross-referencing the message's location with the search area from the previous spring. The carved inscription was located less than half a mile from where Jim's abandoned backpack had been discovered, positioned along a section of trail that search teams had covered multiple times without noticing the recently carved letters. The timing aligned perfectly with Jim's disappearance, suggesting that the message might have been his desperate attempt to leave evidence of foul play. Anya's radio communications with park headquarters crackled with renewed urgency as she coordinated the deployment of an evidence collection team to the inscription site. Marcus found himself designated as a material witness, his amateur photography suddenly elevated to the status of crucial evidence in what was rapidly evolving from a presumed hiking accident into a potential criminal investigation. The bureaucratic machinery that had previously dismissed Jim's disappearance as routine now swung into action with frustrating slowness. Evidence collection protocols required specialized personnel who were not immediately available, creating delays that stretched across several days while the carved message remained exposed to weather conditions that could potentially compromise its forensic value. Temporary protective measures, including a plastic tarp secured over the inscription, provided minimal protection against the desert's harsh environmental conditions. News of the discovery reached Lena Donovan through an indirect chain of communications that began with a local newspaper reporter who had been monitoring police scanner frequencies. The initial phone call came from a journalist seeking comment about developments in her brother's case, blindsiding Lena with information that park officials had not yet officially communicated to the family. The reporter's questions about carved messages and criminal investigations created a moment of disorienting confusion before the implications became clear. The emotional impact hit Lena like a physical blow as she processed the news that her brother might have been the victim of criminal activity rather than a hiking accident. Months of grief and frustration suddenly crystallized into a mixture of vindication and renewed anguish as she realized that her instinctive rejection of the official explanation had been justified. The carved message represented the first tangible evidence that Jim had indeed encountered something beyond the predictable dangers of desert hiking. Lena's hands shook as she called the park headquarters, demanding immediate access to information about the discovery and the investigation it had prompted. The conversation with park officials revealed the institutional reluctance to acknowledge that their original assessment might have been incorrect, with administrators expressing skepticism about the message's authenticity and its connection to Jim's disappearance. Their suggestions that the inscription might be a hoax or unrelated incident infuriated Lena, whose patience with bureaucratic caution had been exhausted months earlier. The official response to the carved message followed predictable patterns of institutional skepticism and procedural delay. Forensic analysis would require weeks to complete, with results that might ultimately prove inconclusive due to the message's exposure to weather conditions and contamination from curious hikers. Administrative protocols demanded extensive documentation and review processes that seemed designed more to protect the Park Service from liability than to pursue justice for Jim's disappearance. Lena's decision to abandon her faith in official investigation procedures crystallized during a particularly frustrating phone conversation with park administrators who continued to characterize the carved message as potentially unrelated to her brother's case. Their insistence on maintaining skeptical distance from evidence that clearly suggested criminal activity revealed a bureaucratic mindset more concerned with avoiding controversy than seeking truth. The realization that she could no longer depend on institutional investigation marked a turning point in Lena's approach to finding answers about her brother's fate. The carved message had provided the first concrete evidence that Jim's disappearance involved circumstances beyond simple hiking mishaps, but official channels seemed determined to minimize its significance through procedural delays and skeptical interpretations that ignored its obvious implications. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like ghostly fingers as Lena Donovan stood at the edge of the south rim, her weathered hands gripping the metal railing with white-knuckled intensity. At 54, her face bore the premature lines of someone who had aged years in the span of months, each sleepless night etched into the deep creases around her eyes. The small hotel room she had rented in Grand Canyon Village had become her temporary command center, its walls covered with topographical maps, printed emails, and photographs that chronicled her brother's hiking history. Her laptop computer, a modest device purchased specifically for this investigation, sat open on the cramped hotel desk surrounded by stacks of geological journals that Jim had subscribed to for decades. The screen displayed a spreadsheet she had meticulously constructed, containing the names and contact information of every geologist, hiking guide, and canyon enthusiast who had ever corresponded with her brother. Each entry represented hours of internet research, phone calls to universities, and conversations with hiking clubs across the Southwest. The first breakthrough came through Dr. Margaret Torres, a geology professor at Northern Arizona University, who had collaborated with Jim on several mineral composition studies throughout the canyon's various formations. Lena's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the professor's office number, knowing that this conversation might provide insights that official investigators had overlooked. Dr. Torres's voice carried the careful precision of an academic who had spent decades analyzing evidence and drawing conclusions from incomplete data. Their meeting took place in a cluttered office overlooking the university campus, where geological specimens from across the Colorado Plateau occupied every available surface. Dr. Torres retrieved a worn field notebook from her desk drawer, its pages filled with Jim's distinctive handwriting, documenting observations about unusual mineral deposits he had encountered during recent expeditions. The professor's weathered fingers traced the carefully sketched diagrams that illustrated rock formations and stratigraphic layers, each drawing accompanied by detailed notes about geographic coordinates and sample locations. The notebook revealed Jim's growing fascination with a particular section of the canyon where he had discovered mineral compositions that didn't match the established geological survey data. His notes described finding traces of rare earth elements in areas where they shouldn't naturally occur, suggesting either undocumented geological processes or human activity that had introduced foreign materials to the environment. The implications were subtle but potentially significant, indicating that Jim might have stumbled upon something that warranted further investigation. Lena's next contact was Thomas Whitehorse, a Navajo hiking guide who had worked with Jim on several expeditions into remote sections of the canyon that were rarely visited by casual tourists. The meeting occurred at a small cafe in Cameron, Arizona, where Thomas's weathered face and careful speech patterns revealed someone who understood the canyon's hidden dangers better than most Park Service personnel. His deep-set eyes held the wisdom of someone whose family had navigated these landscapes for generations. Thomas described Jim's unusual behavior during their last hiking expedition together, approximately 2 months before his disappearance. Jim had been more secretive than usual, frequently consulting GPS coordinates that he kept written on a small piece of paper rather than sharing his intended destinations with his hiking companion. The guide's trained instincts had detected an underlying tension in Jim's manner, as if he were pursuing something specific rather than engaging in his typical geological exploration. The conversation revealed Jim's growing suspicion that someone was systematically removing valuable mineral specimens from protected areas within the canyon. Thomas had dismissed these concerns as paranoia, but in retrospect, Jim's behavior suggested someone who had discovered evidence of illegal activity and was attempting to document it without alerting potential criminals to his investigation. The guide's regret was palpable as he described failing to take Jim's suspicions seriously. Lena's investigation expanded to include contact with the Arizona Geological Society, where Jim had maintained membership for over 15 years. The society's president, Dr. Richard Kowalski, provided access to Jim's recent correspondence and research submissions, revealing a pattern of increasing concern about unauthorized mineral extraction in supposedly protected areas. Jim's letters to the society described finding evidence of systematic excavation in remote locations, including tool marks on rock faces and disturbed soil patterns that suggested organized mining activity. The most revealing discovery came through Jim's correspondence with a freelance mineralogist named David Brennan, who operated a small laboratory specializing in rare earth element analysis. Brennan's emails to Jim, discovered buried in his personal computer files, described unusual samples that Jim had submitted for testing over the past year. The mineral compositions were consistent with high-value materials that would attract the attention of illegal collectors operating in national park lands. Lena's solo hiking expeditions began during the second week of her stay in Grand Canyon Village. Despite warnings from park rangers about the dangers of traveling alone on challenging trails, her hiking experience was limited compared to Jim's expertise. But her determination overcame her fear as she followed the routes described in his field notes. Each expedition was carefully planned using the GPS coordinates from his notebooks, creating a methodical search pattern that covered areas where he might have encountered criminal activity. The physical demands of canyon hiking pushed Lena beyond her comfort zone, as she struggled with the steep descents and challenging terrain that Jim had navigated with easy confidence. Her borrowed hiking boots, purchased hastily from a local outfitter, created blisters that made each step painful, but she pressed forward, driven by an obsessive need to understand what had happened to her brother. The desert heat was merciless, forcing frequent rest stops and careful water management that highlighted her inexperience with backcountry survival. Her emotional state during these solitary expeditions fluctuated between grief-fueled determination and overwhelming despair as the vast canyon landscape emphasized her isolation and the seemingly impossible task of finding answers in such an enormous wilderness. The silence of the desert was broken only by the sound of her labored breathing and the crunch of gravel beneath her feet, creating an atmosphere of profound loneliness that amplified every doubt about her amateur investigation. Memory fragments of childhood adventures with Jim sustained her during the most difficult moments of physical and emotional exhaustion. She recalled summer camping trips where her older brother had patiently taught her to identify different types of rocks and minerals. His enthusiasm for geology infectious, as he explained the ancient forces that had shaped the landscapes they explored together. Those memories provided emotional fuel for her current quest, transforming her grief into a mission to honor his passion for understanding the Earth's secrets. The relationship between the siblings had been strengthened by shared interests in outdoor activities and natural science, creating a bond that transcended the typical dynamics of family obligation. Jim had been both mentor and adventure companion, introducing Lena to hiking and camping experiences that had shaped her appreciation for wilderness environments. His disappearance had severed not only a family connection, but also her primary link to activities and interests that had defined much of her adult recreational life. Lena's investigation notebooks, which she carried during every hiking expedition, gradually filled with observations about areas where Jim's geological interests might have intersected with criminal activity. She documented locations where rock faces showed signs of recent disturbance, areas where vegetation had been damaged by heavy equipment, and sites where the natural landscape displayed evidence of systematic excavation. Her amateur detective work was methodical despite her lack of formal training, driven by an intuitive understanding of her brother's scientific approach to problem-solving. The weight of conducting a solitary investigation began to take its toll after several weeks of intensive hiking and research. Lena's hotel room had become a maze of documents and evidence that would have challenged professional investigators. Yet she persisted with the stubborn determination of someone who refused to accept that her brother's fate would remain forever unknown. Her physical exhaustion was matched by emotional fatigue as she struggled with the possibility that her amateur efforts might ultimately prove futile. The canyon's geological complexity, which had fascinated Jim throughout his adult life, now seemed to mock Lena's efforts to uncover the truth about his disappearance. Every rock formation held potential clues. Every hidden crevice might conceal evidence. But the sheer scale of the landscape made systematic investigation nearly impossible for a single person working without official resources or professional expertise. The same geological diversity that had drawn Jim to these trails now created an overwhelming challenge for someone trying to reconstruct his final days. The desert silence was broken only by the soft scraping sound of Corinne Reynolds's archaeological brush against weathered sandstone, as she carefully exposed what appeared to be pre-Columbian pottery fragments embedded in the canyon wall. At 23, Corinne possessed the methodical patience that distinguished serious archaeology students from treasure hunters. Her movements precise and deliberate as she documented each artifact's exact position before disturbing the surrounding sediment. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her worksite. Located nearly 3 miles from the established Tonto Trail in a remote section of the canyon that few visitors ever discovered. Her field notebook lay open beside her excavation tools, its pages filled with detailed sketches and measurements that would eventually contribute to her master's thesis on indigenous settlement patterns in the Grand Canyon region. The research site had been selected based on preliminary surveys that indicated potential for significant archaeological discoveries, far removed from the tourist-heavy areas where artifact hunting had compromised the integrity of numerous ancient sites. Corinne's supervisor had emphasized the importance of working in undisturbed locations where cultural materials might remain in their original context. The metallic glint caught her peripheral vision during a brief rest from the painstaking excavation work. Something artificial and modern reflected sunlight from beneath a cluster of prickly pear cactus growing in a natural depression, approximately 50 yards from her archaeological grid. The anomaly stood out starkly against the organic textures and earth-toned colors that dominated the natural landscape, immediately triggering her trained instinct to investigate anything that seemed out of place in this pristine environment. Corinne's approach to the suspicious object was guided by the same careful methodology she applied to archaeological excavations. Each step was placed deliberately to avoid disturbing the surrounding area, her eyes scanning for additional evidence that might provide context for whatever lay hidden beneath the thorny vegetation. The desert floor showed subtle signs of previous human activity, including barely visible footprints in areas where wind and weather had not completely erased traces of passage. The small metal box was partially buried beneath a thick layer of decomposed organic matter that had accumulated around the base of the cactus cluster over many months. Corinne's latex gloves, standard equipment for handling potentially contaminated archaeological materials, protected her hands as she carefully brushed away dried leaves and desert debris that concealed the object's true dimensions. The container appeared to be a standard waterproof case, approximately 6 inches long and 4 inches wide, designed to protect electronic equipment from harsh environmental conditions. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the implications of finding modern equipment in such an isolated location. This was not a casual discard by careless hikers, or the accidental loss of gear during a routine expedition. The box's deliberate concealment beneath dense vegetation suggested intentional hiding, possibly by someone who expected to return and retrieve it. The weight of the container indicated substantial contents, far heavier than an empty case should be. Corinne's archaeological training had prepared her to handle unexpected discoveries with appropriate documentation and procedural caution. She retrieved her digital camera from the equipment backpack and began photographing the metal box from multiple angles, establishing its precise location relative to identifiable landmarks and geological features. The GPS coordinates recorded by her field equipment would provide exact positioning data that investigators might require for evidence verification. The decision to open the container required careful consideration of potential legal and safety implications. Corinne understood that her discovery might constitute evidence in criminal investigations or legal proceedings that demanded proper chain of custody documentation. However, her isolated location and the potential urgency of the situation argued for immediate examination of the contents, particularly if they contained information that might be time-sensitive or relevant to ongoing missing person cases. The metal case opened with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. Inside, protected by foam padding that showed signs of careful customization, lay a handheld GPS device whose screen reflected the afternoon sunlight like a dark mirror. The foam padding around the GPS unit was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, creating rust-colored patches that had absorbed into the material over extended exposure to moisture and time. Corinne's hands trembled slightly as she comprehended the significance of her discovery. The bloodstains transformed an otherwise routine piece of hiking equipment into potential evidence of violence or serious injury. Her archaeological background included training in handling human remains and forensic contexts, but the reality of encountering possible crime scene evidence created an emotional impact that academic preparation could not fully address. The GPS device powered on when Corinne pressed the activation button, its screen illuminating with surprising clarity despite months of exposure to desert conditions. The battery indicator showed minimal remaining power, suggesting that the unit had been operating intermittently or had been recently activated. The main display screen showed coordinate information and tracking data that appeared to document a complex route through areas far from established hiking trails. Navigation through the GPS menu system revealed extensive waypoint data and recorded tracks that painted a disturbing picture of movement patterns inconsistent with recreational hiking activities. The recorded route showed a meandering path that frequently doubled back on itself, suggesting either extreme disorientation or deliberate attempts to confuse potential followers. Several waypoints were marked with timestamps indicating travel during nighttime hours, when hiking in the canyon's treacherous terrain would be extremely dangerous. The most alarming discovery within the GPS data was a series of waypoints marked with cryptic abbreviations that suggested systematic documentation of specific locations. The coordinate sequences appeared to follow logical patterns that might represent a deliberate survey or mapping project, possibly related to geological features or mineral deposits. Several of the marked locations corresponded to areas within the canyon that were officially designated as archaeologically sensitive or environmentally protected. Corinne's field training included protocols for reporting discoveries that might have legal implications or significance beyond pure archaeological research. The combination of blood evidence, suspicious location data, and deliberate concealment clearly indicated that her discovery required immediate attention from law enforcement authorities. Her cell phone showed no signal reception in the remote canyon location, necessitating a hike to higher elevation where communication might be possible. The metal container also yielded a small cloth fragment that appeared to have been deliberately placed alongside the GPS device. The fabric was heavily stained with the same rust-colored substance that had contaminated the foam padding, suggesting that it might have been used to apply pressure to a bleeding wound or to clean blood from surfaces. The material's texture and weave pattern indicated outdoor clothing, possibly from a hiking shirt or jacket designed for desert conditions. Hidden beneath the GPS device, Corinne discovered a folded piece of paper that had been carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture damage. The paper contained handwritten notes in blue ink, documenting coordinates and brief descriptions that appeared to reference geological formations and mineral compositions. The handwriting was precise and scientific, suggesting someone with technical training or extensive experience in field research and documentation. The notes included references to unauthorized excavation and systematic removal that implied the writer had discovered evidence of illegal mining or artifact collection activities. Several entries mentioned specific dates and times when suspicious activities had been observed, creating a chronological record that might be crucial for understanding the circumstances surrounding the GPS device's concealment. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Jim Donovan's disappearance had been reported to park authorities. Corinne's archaeological experience had exposed her to various forms of illegal artifact hunting and site destruction. But the discovery suggested something more organized and systematic than typical opportunistic looting. The careful documentation and strategic concealment implied a level of planning and intent that might involve organized criminal activity targeting the canyon's protected resources. The blood evidence added a disturbing dimension that elevated the situation from property crime to potential violence against individuals who had discovered the illegal operations. The emotional weight of her discovery settled heavily on Corinne's shoulders as she carefully repacked the metal container and prepared for the challenging hike to an elevation where cellular communication might be possible. The GPS device and its associated evidence represented not just archaeological significance, but potentially crucial information about human tragedy and criminal activity. Her hands shook slightly as she secured the container in her backpack, understanding that her accidental discovery might provide answers that grieving families had been seeking for months. The sunset painted the canyon walls in brilliant shades of orange and red as Corinne began her ascent toward the rim, each step carrying her closer to communication capabilities that would allow her to report her discovery to appropriate authorities. The weight of the metal container seemed to increase with each upward stride, not from its physical mass, but from the growing realization that she carried evidence that might finally explain the mysterious disappearance that had haunted the Grand Canyon community for nearly 2 years. The sterile fluorescent lighting in the FBI Regional Laboratory in Phoenix cast harsh shadows across the evidence examination table, where Jim Donovan's GPS device lay connected to a sophisticated computer analysis system. Special Agent Maria Santos adjusted her reading glasses as streams of data cascaded down multiple monitor screens, each line of code revealing fragments of a story that contradicted everything investigators had previously assumed about the missing geologist's final days. The digital forensics specialist working alongside her had spent 18 hours extracting and reconstructing the device's corrupted memory files, piece by piece, recovering a chronological record that would reshape the entire investigation. The GPS tracking data painted a complex picture of deliberate movement patterns that bore no resemblance to the wandering paths typically associated with lost or disoriented hikers. Jim's recorded route showed systematic reconnaissance of remote canyon locations, with waypoints marked at regular intervals in a grid pattern that suggested methodical surveillance rather than casual geological exploration. The timestamps indicated that much of this activity had occurred during pre-dawn hours when visibility was limited, and the likelihood of encountering other hikers was virtually zero. Agent Santos traced her finger across the printed map where the GPS coordinates had been plotted, noting the strategic positioning of observation points that provided visual coverage of several archaeological sites known to contain valuable Native American artifacts. The pattern became unmistakably clear as she connected the waypoints with colored lines, revealing a surveillance network that would have allowed one person to monitor multiple locations for suspicious activity. Jim's movements demonstrated the methodical approach of someone conducting an investigation, rather than fleeing from danger. The laboratory's DNA analysis results arrived via secure email, while Agent Santos was still studying the GPS data, adding another layer of complexity to the emerging picture. The blood samples recovered from the device and associated fabric contained genetic material from 2 distinct individuals, including a profile that matched James Donovan's medical records provided by his sister. The second DNA profile triggered immediate alerts when run through the FBI's criminal database, revealing a match with Raymond Ortega, a 34-year-old tour guide with previous arrests for artifact trafficking and theft of archaeological materials from protected federal lands. Raymond Ortega's criminal history painted a portrait of someone who had systematically exploited his legitimate access to remote areas of the Grand Canyon to conduct illegal excavation and removal of valuable cultural artifacts. His tour guide credentials provided the perfect cover for regular visits to archaeologically sensitive areas, while his intimate knowledge of canyon geography allowed him to identify and exploit sites that were rarely monitored by Park Service personnel. Court records showed that previous investigations had been hampered by lack of physical evidence and difficulty proving that artifacts had been removed from their original locations. The forensic analysis of the handwritten notes found with the GPS device confirmed that Jim had been methodically documenting evidence of illegal artifact removal over a period of several months. His geological training had enabled him to recognize signs of unauthorized excavation that might escape the notice of casual observers, including soil disturbance patterns, tool marks on rock faces, and alterations to natural sediment layers around archaeological sites. The precision and detail of his observations suggested someone building a case that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Agent Santos contacted Ranger Anya Sharma to coordinate the integration of new evidence with the Park Service's existing case files, knowing that the revelation would require a complete reassessment of the search and rescue efforts that had been conducted nearly 2 years earlier. The phone conversation revealed Anya's mixture of vindication and frustration as she processed the implications of evidence that had been hidden in plain sight, while official investigators focused on standard missing hiker protocols. The reconstructed timeline began to reveal the true sequence of events that had led to Jim's disappearance. His geological surveys had inadvertently uncovered evidence of systematic artifact theft occurring at multiple sites throughout the canyon, prompting him to begin his own covert investigation, using scientific documentation methods that would create admissible evidence for law enforcement. The GPS waypoints corresponded exactly with locations where he had observed suspicious excavation activity, and collected photographic evidence of disturbed archaeological sites. Jim's field notebooks, retrieved from his sister's collection of personal effects, contained detailed sketches and measurements that corroborated the GPS evidence and provided additional context for his investigation. His drawings showed precise documentation of excavation sites before and after disturbance, with careful notation of artifacts that had been removed and techniques used to conceal evidence of illegal activity. The scientific rigor of his approach demonstrated someone who understood the legal requirements for presenting evidence in criminal proceedings. The confrontation between Jim and the artifact thieves could be reconstructed through analysis of the final GPS waypoints and the pattern of blood evidence on the device. The data showed that Jim had positioned himself at an observation point overlooking one of the primary excavation sites during the early morning hours when illegal activity typically occurred. His final recorded movement showed rapid displacement away from his observation position, indicating that his surveillance had been discovered and he had been forced to flee through treacherous terrain. The blood spatter analysis revealed that Jim had sustained significant injuries during his escape attempt, likely from falls on sharp rocks or deliberate violence inflicted by his pursuers. The trail of blood evidence led investigators to a narrow canyon fissure where Jim's remains were eventually discovered, along with a backpack containing photographic evidence and artifact samples that would prove crucial to prosecuting the theft operation. His dedication to protecting the canyon's archaeological treasures had ultimately cost him his life. Lena Donovan's emotional reaction to the truth about her brother's death was a complex mixture of grief, pride, and anger, as she processed the revelation that Jim had died as a hero rather than a victim of misfortune. The knowledge that he had been working to protect irreplaceable cultural artifacts from criminal exploitation provided some measure of comfort, but also intensified her sorrow that his noble efforts had gone unrecognized during the initial investigation. Her months of solitary research had been vindicated, confirming her instinctive belief that her brother would never have simply gotten lost or suffered an accidental death. The artifact theft operation that Jim had uncovered proved to be far more extensive than initially suspected, involving a network of individuals who had been systematically looting archaeological sites throughout the Southwest for nearly a decade. Raymond Ortega's tour guide operation had served as the perfect front for identifying and accessing valuable sites, while his criminal associates handled the illegal sale and distribution of stolen artifacts through underground collectors and international black markets. Federal prosecutors used Jim's meticulously documented evidence to build cases against multiple defendants involved in the theft operation, resulting in convictions that disrupted one of the largest archaeological artifact trafficking networks ever discovered in the American Southwest. The legal proceedings revealed the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise and the enormous financial value of the cultural materials that had been systematically stolen from protected lands over many years. The Park Service implemented new security measures and surveillance protocols based on lessons learned from Jim's investigation, including enhanced monitoring of remote archaeological sites and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and academic researchers who might observe suspicious activity during legitimate fieldwork. His unofficial investigation had exposed systematic vulnerabilities in the protection of cultural resources that had been exploited by organized criminal networks for years. Jim's legacy evolved from tragic hiking accident victim to posthumous hero whose scientific training and dedication to preserving cultural heritage had ultimately led to the prosecution of major archaeological crimes. The irony of his situation became painfully clear as investigators realized that his expertise and methodical approach had made him uniquely qualified to recognize and document evidence that professional law enforcement had missed during routine patrols and investigations. The final piece of evidence that confirmed Jim's heroic role in exposing the artifact theft operation was found in a safety deposit box that he had rented under an assumed name 3 months before his disappearance. The box contained backup copies of all his photographic evidence, detailed maps of excavation sites, and a comprehensive written report that he had prepared for submission to federal authorities once his investigation was complete. His systematic approach to building an airtight legal case had been motivated by his deep respect for the canyon's cultural significance and his determination to ensure that those responsible for destroying irreplaceable archaeological sites would face appropriate consequences for their crimes. The morning mist hung like a shroud over the canyon walls as the recovery team assembled at the coordinates that Jim's GPS device had finally revealed. Special Agent Maria Santos stood at the edge of a narrow fissure in the red sandstone, her breath forming small clouds in the cool desert air as she peered into the shadowy depths where advanced ground-penetrating radar had detected human remains. The crack in the ancient rock face was barely 3 feet wide at its opening, but extended downward for nearly 40 feet into a natural chamber that had been carved by millions of years of water erosion and geological settling. Ranger Anya Sharma positioned herself beside the FBI agent, her weathered hands gripping the safety rope that would lower the recovery specialists into the confined space. The weight of nearly 2 years of unanswered questions pressed heavily on her shoulders as she watched the technical rescue team prepare their equipment for the delicate operation ahead. Her radio crackled with routine communications from other Park Service personnel who were maintaining a security perimeter around the recovery site, but the words seemed distant and muffled by the emotional significance of the moment. The specialized recovery equipment included high-powered LED lighting systems that would illuminate the depths of the fissure, allowing forensic photographers to document the scene before any evidence was disturbed. Advanced rappelling gear, designed specifically for confined space rescue operations, would enable the recovery team to navigate the treacherous descent while preserving the integrity of potential evidence scattered throughout the narrow chamber. The team had trained extensively for similar operations, but the emotional weight of recovering someone who had become a symbol of unanswered questions created an atmosphere of solemn reverence. Lena Donovan waited in a Park Service vehicle parked 50 yards from the recovery site, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she struggled with the conflicting emotions of finally approaching closure, while simultaneously confronting the definitive end of hope. She had chosen not to witness the actual recovery operation, understanding that some images would be too painful to carry for the rest of her life, but her presence nearby provided emotional support for the rangers and investigators who had shared her long journey toward truth. The first item brought to the surface was Jim's geological hammer, its metal surface dulled by months of exposure to moisture and mineral deposits within the fissure. The tool that had been his constant companion during decades of canyon exploration emerged from the shadows like an artifact from an archaeological excavation, carrying with it the weight of countless hiking adventures and scientific discoveries. Anya's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the familiar implement that had become synonymous with Jim's passionate pursuit of geological knowledge. The recovery of Jim's field notebook required specialized handling due to its fragile condition after extended exposure to the humid environment within the rock chamber. The leather cover had absorbed moisture and mineral deposits, transforming it into something resembling an ancient manuscript that archaeologists might discover in a sealed tomb. The pages inside, protected partially by the leather binding, contained the final observations and theories that Jim had been developing before his tragic encounter with the artifact thieves. Jim's camera, discovered near his remains, contained the last photographs he had taken while documenting the illegal excavation activities that had ultimately cost him his life. The memory card, miraculously preserved within the camera's weatherproof housing, held images that would provide crucial evidence for the federal prosecution of the artifact theft operation. These final photographs showed systematic destruction of archaeological sites and the removal of irreplaceable cultural artifacts, creating a visual record of crimes that Jim had died trying to expose. The most heartbreaking discovery was a small waterproof pouch containing a letter that Jim had written to his sister, apparently intended to be found in case something happened to him during his investigation. The letter, written in his careful handwriting on weather-resistant paper, explained his growing concern about the systematic theft of archaeological treasures and his decision to document evidence that could be used to prosecute the criminals. His words revealed the internal struggle between his desire to protect his sister from worry and his moral obligation to preserve the canyon's cultural heritage. The recovery team worked with painstaking care to extract Jim's remains from the narrow chamber, treating his body with the dignity and respect that had been denied during the months he had lain undiscovered in the canyon's depths. The confined space had protected his remains from scavengers and weather, but the tragic circumstances of his death were evident from the trauma injuries that corroborated the GPS evidence of his desperate flight from his pursuers. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated that Jim had survived the initial fall into the fissure, but had succumbed to his injuries over a period of hours or days. The formal notification of Lena about the recovery was conducted with the careful sensitivity that such moments require. But no amount of professional training could soften the brutal finality of having her worst fears confirmed. Agent Santos delivered the news in the privacy of the Park Service Administrative Office, her words measured and compassionate as she explained that Jim's remains had been found along with evidence that confirmed his heroic efforts to protect the canyon's archaeological treasures. The mixture of grief and pride that crossed Lena's face reflected the complex emotions of learning that her brother had died not as a victim, but as a guardian of cultural heritage. The federal prosecution of the artifact theft ring proceeded with unprecedented speed and thoroughness, fueled by the compelling evidence that Jim had died to preserve. Raymond Ortega and his criminal associates faced federal charges that included conspiracy, theft of government property, destruction of archaeological resources, and ultimately, felony murder in connection with Jim's death. The legal proceedings revealed the sophisticated nature of their operation and the enormous financial value of the cultural materials they had systematically stolen from protected lands. Jim's funeral service was held at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, with the vast expanse of the landscape that had defined his life serving as both backdrop and memorial. Geologists from across the Southwest attended to pay their respects to a colleague whose amateur status had never diminished his contributions to their field. Park rangers, hiking guides, and canyon enthusiasts gathered to honor someone who had embodied the best qualities of those who truly understood and respected the magnificent wilderness. The memorial service featured readings from Jim's geological journals, sharing his eloquent descriptions of the canyon's formation and his deep appreciation for the ancient forces that had created such spectacular beauty. His sister read passages from his final letter, where he had written about his responsibility to protect irreplaceable cultural artifacts for future generations, even if it meant placing himself in danger. The words revealed a man who understood that some principles were worth defending, regardless of personal cost. A permanent memorial was established at the location where Jim's investigation had begun, featuring a bronze plaque that recognized his contributions to protecting archaeological resources and his ultimate sacrifice in the pursuit of justice. The memorial site became a place of pilgrimage for those who understood the significance of his work and the courage required to stand against organized crime that was systematically destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage. Lena's transformation from grieving sister to advocate for archaeological protection was fueled by her desire to ensure that Jim's death would have lasting meaning beyond the prosecution of his killers. She worked with federal legislators to strengthen penalties for archaeological resource crimes and lobbied for increased funding for law enforcement efforts to protect cultural sites on public lands. Her testimony before congressional committees carried the emotional weight of personal loss combined with detailed knowledge of the systematic destruction that her brother had died trying to prevent. The partnership between Lena and Ranger Anya Sharma evolved into an ongoing collaboration to improve investigative procedures for missing person cases that might involve criminal activity rather than typical hiking accidents. Their efforts led to protocol changes that required more thorough investigation of disappearances involving experienced outdoor enthusiasts, whose knowledge and skills made simple accidents unlikely explanations. The institutional changes they advocated were implemented as the Donovan Protocols, ensuring that Jim's name would be permanently associated with improved protection for both visitors and cultural resources. The final resolution of Jim's case brought closure to those who had known him, but also created a lasting legacy that extended far beyond the resolution of a single missing person investigation. His meticulous documentation of archaeological crimes led to the recovery and return of hundreds of stolen artifacts to their appropriate tribal communities, restoring cultural treasures that had been destined for illegal sale to private collectors. The scientific methods he had used to build evidence became models for training other citizen scientists who might encounter similar criminal activity during legitimate research. The Grand Canyon itself seemed to embrace Jim's memory, with the geological formations that had fascinated him throughout his life now serving as monuments to his dedication and sacrifice. The ancient rocks that had witnessed his final courageous act continued their eternal watch over the landscape he had died to protect, ensuring that future generations would inherit the same magnificent wilderness that had inspired his lifelong passion for understanding the Earth's deepest secrets. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.